Before I start my story, I just want to say one thing. We spend our whole lives sacrificing for the people we love. Yet, in the end, those same people are the ones who leave us standing at the door. If you believe that elders deserve respect, then please like and subscribe to my channel and watch this video till the end so you can truly understand this story. I never thought that the people I loved the most could turn against me so completely. My name is Margaret, and for over 20 years, I poured my heart and soul into my family. I raised my son, Daniel, with patience, love, and sacrifices I didn't even realize I was making until years later. I was the kind of mother-in-law who tried to be supportive, understanding, and helpful, sometimes even when it wasn't appreciated. But nothing could have prepared me for the day I found myself standing on my doorstep, a suitcase in my hand, and my daughter-in-law staring at me with cold eyes. It all began subtly, like most betrayals do. Julia, my son's wife, had always been a bit sharp-tongued, but I ignored the early signs. I told myself that maybe she was stressed with work, adjusting to marriage, or simply having a hard day. But over the past few months, her complaints had escalated. Every meal I prepared, every effort to help around the house seemed to irritate her. "You don't need to be here all the time, Mom," she said one morning, with that tone I had come to fear. "Daniel and I have things under control. We don't need extra mouths to feed." I froze. Extra mouths to feed. Was this how my own family saw me now? I had spent decades ensuring my son had a good life, supporting him through school, emotional struggles, even helping him with his first apartment. We just can't have the arrangement anymore. It was the final blow. I remember my hands trembling, my heart pounding, and a wave of disbelief washing over me. For a moment, I thought it must be a dream or a cruel joke. But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She meant it. By the end of the day, I was out on the street with nothing but a single suitcase of clothes and a heart heavier than I could bear. I wandered through the city, the bitter December wind cutting through my coat, matching the chill in my soul. Everywhere I looked, I saw happy families, couples laughing, mothers and daughters sharing moments I would no longer have in my own home. It was a cruel reminder of everything I had lost, not just a home, but the trust and love of my own family. The first nights were the hardest. I stayed in a small, cheap motel where the walls were thin and the heat barely adequate. I could hear every creak, every cough from the neighboring rooms, and it reminded me painfully of how alone I truly was. I cried myself to sleep, imagining my son inside, perhaps conflicted, perhaps quietly resenting me, and Julia smiling in her warm, cozy home, but probably feeling victorious. But after the initial wave of despair, something inside me stirred, a tiny spark of determination, barely noticeable at first, but growing stronger with every passing day. I had always been a survivor. Life had thrown challenges at me before, and I had faced them head-on, and I knew deep down that this betrayal, as painful as it was, wouldn't define me. It couldn't. I started small. I looked for part-time work, anything that could get me by. I cleaned houses, did odd jobs, even babysat occasionally. Each dollar I earned was a tiny victory, a reminder that I still had the power to take care of myself. I refused to let Julia's cruelty strip me of my dignity. At night, I would sit alone in the dimly lit motel room and replay the events in my mind. I thought about Daniel, my sweet, naive son, caught between the two of us. I felt no anger toward him. He was a man torn by loyalty, but Julia's words had lit a fire in me that I couldn't ignore. I couldn't just vanish quietly into the shadows. I had to rise, and I had to ensure that the people who had wronged me would never underestimate me again. As the weeks passed, I learned to navigate the city with a new purpose. I researched opportunities, read about successful women who had rebuilt their lives from nothing, and slowly, a plan began to form. If Julia thought she had the upper hand, she was wrong. She didn't know the woman she had hurt. She didn't know that every tear, every sleepless night, was fueling a drive stronger than she could imagine. I found a small apartment to rent, modest but clean, where I could start rebuilding my life. I furnished it carefully, adding touches that reminded me of the home I had lost, yet made it my own. This wasn't just survival anymore, it was preparation. Preparation for the day when I would reclaim not just my dignity, but my power. And as I unpacked the last box, I looked at the skyline of the city through my window and whispered to myself, they may have thrown me out, but they will never control me again. That night, I slept with a resolve that I hadn't felt in years. Betrayal had hurt me deeply, but it had also awakened something within me. Something fierce, relentless, and unstoppable. And little did Julia know, her triumph was the first step in my ultimate victory. The first few weeks after being thrown out were the hardest of my life. Each morning I woke up in my small apartment, the walls to bare, the air to quiet, and I was painfully reminded of what I had lost. My son Daniel, who had been my pride and joy, was no longer by my side. And Julia, my daughter-in-law, that cold, calculating woman, had taken over my life in a way I could never have imagined. Every corner of my former home held memories of laughter, holidays, and family dinners, but now those memories felt like ghosts, haunting me for the mistakes I never made. I quickly realized that surviving alone wasn't just about finding a roof over my head. It was about regaining control of my life, one step at a time. Money became my first hurdle. I had some savings, but not enough to live comfortably for long. I began taking odd jobs, cleaning houses, babysitting, delivering groceries. Each day was exhausting, but each night, when I counted my earnings, I felt a strange sense of pride. I was earning my way back, even if slowly, even if painfully. Asterisks at the beginning. Every small interaction was a reminder of my displacement. Friends would ask about my family. Neighbors would glance curiously at the stranger in the hallway, and I had to force a smile while hiding the shame that clung to me like a second skin. I refused to let anyone see how broken I felt inside. Sleep was my only relief. At night, I would lie on my small couch, listening to the hum of the city outside, imagining a life where I had power again, where Julia couldn't sneer at me or dictate how I should live. I wrote notes to myself, detailing small plans: save more, learn about property, research investments. At first, it seemed like a fantasy, a dream too big for someone in my position. But as the days passed, I realized that dreams were only useless if you let fear stop you from chasing them. Even in my lowest moments, I refused to pity myself. I had survived hardship before. Life had a way of testing me, of pushing me to the edge, and I had always come back stronger. This betrayal, painful as it was, would not be the end of my story. It would be the beginning of my rise. I began to see the city differently. Where I had once only seen loneliness and cold streets, I now saw opportunity. Every building I passed, every for sale sign, and every newspaper listing became a hint of what might be possible. I started talking to people, asking questions about real estate, about investments, about how to turn a small savings account into something substantial. I learned quickly, necessity has a way of sharpening the mind. At the same time, I allowed myself to grieve. I cried for my lost home, for my son who was caught in the middle, and for the betrayal that cut so deeply, but I never let my grief consume me entirely. I channeled it into determination. If Julia thought she had defeated me, she was wrong. She didn't realize that every tear I shed, every lonely night, and every penny I saved was fueling a fire that would one day burn brighter than she could imagine. One evening, I sat at a small cafe, sipping my coffee and watching people pass by. Families laughed, couples held hands, children ran in the park. I allowed myself a pang of longing, but instead of feeling despair, I felt resolve. I would rebuild my life, I would rise, and most importantly, I would ensure that those who had kicked me out, who had dismissed me as useless and unnecessary, would one day realize just how powerful I had become. I took small steps at first: budgeting, learning about investments online, even attending local seminars on property and business management. I met other women who had faced similar betrayals and come back stronger. Their stories became my inspiration, proof that survival was only the beginning and victory was possible. As months passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I was no longer just surviving, I was planning. Every dollar saved, every lesson learned, every contact made was a piece of the puzzle. I began envisioning the future, a building of my own, Perhaps even one where Julia and Daniel could never take me for granted again. The idea thrilled me, not because I wanted revenge for its own sake, but because I wanted to reclaim control of my life. For too long, I had let others' opinions dictate my worth. No more. There were moments of weakness. Of course, nights when I wondered if my son resented me, or if Julia would somehow continue to win, despite my efforts. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the truth. I was capable, I was strong, and I was no longer a victim. I had been thrown out, but I was not defeated. By the end of these months, I had accomplished something remarkable. I had secured enough savings to seriously consider purchasing a property. Not just any property, but a building, something that would give me both independence and a measure of influence over the people who had tried to erase me from their lives. Every decision I made, every choice I considered, was filtered through a lens of strategy. I wasn't acting on impulse. I was carefully crafting a path that would lead me back to the life I deserved. And in quiet moments, when the city lights glittered against the night sky, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Julia might have thought she had won. She might have believed that kicking me out was the end of my story. But she had no idea. Every hardship, every lonely night, every painful moment had prepared me for something far greater. I had been abandoned. Yes, I had been ridiculed and dismissed, but I was not broken. And soon, the tables would turn. Julia and Daniel would learn, in their own way, that the woman they had tried to discard was not someone to be underestimated. I was building more than a life for myself. I was building power, respect, and ultimately, justice. That spark of determination, once tiny, had grown into a roaring flame. And as I went to bed that night, exhausted yet alive with purpose, I whispered to myself, I will rise. I will not just survive, I will thrive. And one day, they will understand the woman they tried to destroy. The cold months of struggle had passed, and I was no longer the frightened, displaced woman who had wandered the streets after being thrown out. I had survived the loneliness, the judgmental looks, the small humiliations that had seemed insurmountable, and now I felt a fire within me, a need not just to survive, but to rise, to reclaim what had been taken, and to regain my dignity in a way that no one could question. I spent countless nights researching real estate. Seemed daunting at first, a world dominated by men with connections, money, and confidence I didn't yet feel I possessed. But I knew that if I learned, if I planned carefully, there was no reason I couldn't succeed. I read books, attended workshops, and reached out to mentors who had built empires from nothing. Every piece of knowledge was another brick in the foundation I was quietly building. By now, my routine had changed entirely. Days were spent working odd jobs, yes, but nights were sacred. Nights belonged to planning, strategizing, and envisioning my comeback. I sketched out budgets, analyzed property listings, and created a timeline for purchasing my own building. I imagined the day I could walk into the lobby, keys in hand, knowing that my family, Julia or Daniel, everyone would have no choice but to recognize my strength. It wasn't only about money or property, it was about control. For too long, my life had been dictated by others' opinions, their whims, and their cruelty. I refused to let that continue. The idea of owning the apartment building where Julia and Daniel lived became my obsession. I pictured the moment they realized the tables had turned, that the person they had tried to humiliate now held power over their daily lives. I started networking with real estate agents, learning the legalities of ownership, and understanding tenant rights. It was a steep learning curve, but every challenge felt like a test I was ready to pass. Each phone call, each email, each meeting gave me confidence. The woman who had once been kicked out with a suitcase in her hand was evolving into someone strategic, patient, and powerful. Meanwhile, life outside my plans continued. I maintained my jobs, interacted politely with neighbors, and ensured no one suspected the storm I was preparing. The duality of my existence was thrilling. Outwardly, I appeared to be just another single woman rebuilding her life. Inwardly, I was a woman plotting a reclamation that would be both subtle and absolute. During this time, I also reflected on my relationship with Daniel. I loved my son deeply, but his loyalty to Julia had clouded his judgment. I knew that my rise wouldn't just prove Julia wrong, It would also remind Daniel of the strength and wisdom he had always admired in me. I didn't want revenge in its cruelest form. I wanted recognition, respect, and a reversal of the roles that had caused so much pain. The months of preparation came to fruition when I finally found the building that met my criteria: strategically located, well-maintained, and affordable enough for me to purchase without overextending myself. I toured the property multiple times, imagining every detail of my plan: the lobby, the apartments, the stairwells. All of it was a canvas for my strategy. This was more than a building. It was a symbol of my perseverance, my intelligence, and my resilience. When I made the offer and it was accepted, a wave of triumph washed over me. I had done it. I had turned months of struggle, sleepless nights, and relentless effort into tangible power. Holding the keys in my hand for the first time, I realized something profound. I was no longer a victim. I was a force to be reckoned with. And Julia, who had dismissed me, laughed at my plight and thought she had won, would soon learn the consequences of underestimating me. I didn't act impulsively. I watched, planned, and waited for the perfect moment to introduce the change. The apartment building, now mine, would soon be the same place where Julia and Daniel had taken their sense of security for granted. I envisioned the look on Julia's face when she realized that the woman she had tried to destroy was now her landlord. The thought sent a shiver of satisfaction down my spine, not out of cruelty, but because justice, patience, and strategy had finally aligned. Through it all, I grew in confidence. I spoke with authority in meetings, made financial decisions with precision, and walked with a new posture, a new self-respect. Each day brought a deeper sense of empowerment. I was no longer reacting to life. I was controlling it. Every effort I had made during my months of struggle had prepared me for this, and soon the world, including my family, would see the woman I had become. That night, as I placed the keys on my kitchen counter and admired the view of the city skyline from my modest apartment, I allowed myself a quiet smile. I had risen from despair, navigated challenges, and strategically positioned myself to reclaim my dignity and authority. I whispered to myself, "The storm is coming. And when it hits, they'll realize that underestimating me was there." The day I officially became the owner of the building was surreal. I held the keys in my hands, a tangible symbol of months of planning, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. For the first time since being thrown out by Julia, I felt not just relief or pride, but power. Power over my own life, over my future, and subtly over the very people who had tried to dismiss me. I didn't rush to confront Julia. Patience had been my ally all along. I watched from a distance, observing her routines, noting her dependence on the building and the convenience it offered. She and Daniel had been living there for over a year, assuming their security was untouchable, blind to the changes happening behind the scenes. It was almost poetic. Her sense of dominance over me had been an illusion all along. The first time I approached them as their landlord, I did it with calm authority. I wasn't vengeful in an obvious way. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. I introduced myself as Margaret, the new owner of the building, presenting the lease documents professionally. Julia's face changed instantly, a flicker of shock, disbelief, and, I think, fear. It was subtle, but it was there. Margaret, you own this building. Julia, stamnored. Yes, I said firmly, holding her gaze. And as of today, rent payments are due. I expect all tenants to respect the terms of their lease. Daniel's eyes widened as well, caught between disbelief and embarrassment. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and electric. I could almost taste the tension. All those months of planning, learning, and struggling had led to this exact moment. Seeing Julia's reaction was oddly satisfying, but I didn't let it consume me. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about justice, fairness, and the reclamation of dignity. I maintained my composure, smiling politely while handing over the lease agreements. The message was clear. I was no longer powerless. Over the following weeks, the dynamics shifted entirely. Julia, who had once dictated my presence and treated me as a burden, now had to follow my rules. She couldn't skip payments, complain about repairs, or ignore the responsibilities of tenancy. Every interaction subtly reminded her that the woman she had dismissed was now in control. I noticed changes in Daniel as well. My son, caught between loyalty and realization, began treating me with the respect he had always intended but never expressed. There was a quiet acknowledgement in his ease, a recognition that I had endured betrayal, survived alone, and emerged stronger. The family balance had shifted, not through anger or aggression, but through strategy, resilience, and patience. As the weeks turned into months, I embraced my role fully. I managed the building with efficiency, fairness, and care. I repaired the apartments, ensured the tenants' comfort, and made decisions that improved the property's value. Julia and Daniel could no longer belittle me. They were dependent on me for the very roof over their heads. It was a strange sensation watching them navigate the rules I set, answering to a woman they had once tried to discard. But it wasn't cruel, it was empowerment. I wasn't vindictive, I was asserting my rightful place in the world, reclaiming control that had been taken from me. Social interactions began to change as well. Other tenants noticed the shift in authority, the calm confidence with which I managed the building. I became a figure of respect, someone who had overcome adversity and now commanded acknowledgement. This wasn't just about Julia or Daniel anymore. It was about every person who had underestimated me, every person who had doubted that a woman could rise from betrayal to power. The psychological shift within me was profound. Where once I had felt anger, resentment, and despair, I now felt clarity, control, and satisfaction. I had learned the importance of patience, of strategy, and of maintaining dignity in the face of betrayal. Julia's glances, once filled with arrogance, were now cautious, respectful, and even a little fearful. I had achieved what I had set out to do, not through aggression, but through deliberate, calculated action. One afternoon, as I walked through the lobby, Julia approached me hesitantly. "Margaret, I understand, I'll make sure rent is paid on time," she stammered. I smiled gently, a small but deliberate gesture of calm authority. "I'm glad to hear that, Julia. I expect all tenants to honor their commitments. That's all I ask." It was more than words, it was a declaration. The tables had turned, and the family dynamic had been rewritten. I was no longer the woman dismissed and abandoned. I was the one with control, respect, and recognition. Even Daniel seemed to understand the lesson. He treated me differently, now not with fear, but with acknowledgement. The respect that had once been buried under familial loyalty and blind affection had been unearthed by circumstance and deliberate action. By the end of the month, the rent was paid promptly, and Julia's behavior had shifted subtly but noticeably. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, just an unspoken acknowledgement of power. I had achieved a rare form of justice, one that didn't rely on humiliation or revenge, but on strategic empowerment and self-respect. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing the building's accounts, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Betrayal had sparked my determination, struggle had honed my skills, and patience had allowed me to rise at precisely the right moment. Julia and Daniel had unwittingly played their parts in my transformation, and I had seized the opportunity to reclaim my life on my own terms. For the first time in years, I felt complete. I had survived, I had planned, and I had executed. And now, finally, the power that had been taken from me was fully restored. The shift was not just external, it was internal. I had become the woman I was always capable of being: strong, respected, and in control. And as I looked out over the city skyline from my office window, I whispered quietly to myself, a mixture of triumph and satisfaction in my voice. I am not the woman they tried to destroy. I am the woman they now answer to. The city skyline had never looked more beautiful to me. From my office window, I could see the endless flow of lights, streets buzzing with life, and the pulse of a world that I had finally reclaimed my place in. After months of struggle, planning, and patient execution, I had achieved what once seemed impossible. The building I owned was no longer just a property, it was a symbol of my journey, a monument to my resilience, and a silent testament to the woman I had become. I thought back To the day Julia had kicked me out, the shock, the heartbreak, the humiliation it all seemed like a distant memory now, a necessary storm that had shaped me. At the time, I had felt powerless, abandoned, and lost. But every tear I shed, every sleepless night I endured, and every dollar I saved had prepared me for this very moment. What had seemed like an ending was actually the beginning of my true life. Walking through the lobby, I noticed the subtle shift in Julia's demeanor. She greeted me politely, her once sharp tongue now softened by circumstance. Daniel, too, had changed. His respect for me was no longer the result of fear or obligation, but genuine acknowledgement of the strength, patience, and intelligence I had displayed. The family dynamic, once unbalanced and painful, had found a new equilibrium. I had learned something invaluable through this journey. Power is not about cruelty or aggression. True power lies in patience, strategy, and the ability to transform adversity into opportunity. I had reclaimed my authority, not by seeking revenge in the traditional sense, but by rising above the circumstances and demonstrating my worth through action. The tenants of the building respected me. They saw the woman who had navigated challenges with grace and determination. I had become a figure of stability, fairness, and quiet authority. Each interaction reminded me that I had built something far greater than financial security. I had cultivated respect, influence, and dignity. Yet, amidst all the success, I never forgot the lessons of my past. I remembered the loneliness, the fear, and the despair. Those memories were not chains to hold me back, but markers of my growth. They reminded me of the woman I had been, the obstacles I had overcome, and the resilience I had discovered within myself. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing the accounts, I realized how far I had come. The building was thriving, the tenants were happy, and Julia and Daniel had adjusted to their new roles without incident. The power dynamics were no longer about dominance or punishment, but mutual respect and understanding. I had restored balance, and in doing so, I had healed a part of myself that I had long thought broken. I thought about my son, Daniel, and the complex emotions that had surrounded our family. He had been caught between loyalty to his wife and love for his mother, and in many ways, his confusion had mirrored my own journey. But through patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve, I had navigated these relationships without losing my integrity. The reconciliation was subtle but profound, an acknowledgement that even strained bonds could evolve when approached with care and wisdom. At night, I often reflected on my journey in quiet solitude. The path had been difficult, fraught with emotional turmoil and uncertainty. Yet, every challenge had been a step toward empowerment. The betrayal that had once wounded me so deeply had become the catalyst for transformation. I had discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, patience I hadn't realized I could muster, and strategic insight that had guided me to victory. My building was more than a structure. It was a sanctuary, a representation of resilience, and a symbol of the new life I had created. Each tenant, each interaction, and each day of managing the property reminded me that my life was now defined by my choices, my actions, and my courage. I had moved from despair to triumph, from rejection to respect, and from fear to empowerment. Looking back, I could see the full arc of my journey. I had been betrayed, abandoned, and underestimated. I had faced loneliness, financial struggle, and emotional pain. Yet, I had transformed every obstacle into an opportunity, every setback into a stepping stone. I had risen stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than ever before. And as I gazed out at the city, the lights reflecting the endless possibilities ahead, I felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. I had not only reclaimed my life, but had reshaped it on my terms. The woman who had once been cast aside was now a symbol of resilience, power, and dignity. I whispered softly to myself, a mixture of pride and quiet triumph in my voice. I have survived. I have risen. And now I live as the woman I was always meant to be. The journey had been long, and the path had been steep, but I had reached the summit. Betrayal had tested me, struggle had strengthened me, and patience had guided me to victory. Now, I stood not only as a survivor, but as a woman in control of her destiny, respected by those who had once sought to diminish her, and inspired by the the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in years, I slept with a calm heart and a mind at peace. The storm had passed, and I had emerged unscathed, empowered, and triumphant. Life had given me a cruel challenge, and I had turned it into my greatest victory. And as the city lights twinkled beneath me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer the woman who had been abandoned and underestimated. I was Margaret, strong, independent, and unstoppable.